And we're back. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, we're going to dig into this sort of yin and yang of both fear and excitement of learning in a new era. And, as I mentioned, Aaron and I have been, kind of going through this probably for the last year or so around AI. He got involved with it a little bit earlier than I did, but, we've been kind of trying to figure out, and maybe this is our own fault because on the Cloudcast, we tend to try and cover a little bit of everything. And so I think maybe in our mind, we're trying to cover a little bit of everything as opposed to sort of digging into certain specific things that maybe are specifically relevant to our day job or specifically relevant to some area in which we can have an impact. But we've been, generally trying to learn the bigger picture of it. And I think part of that's because it helps us in our learning process of, understanding, okay, if I kind of get the bigger picture, I understand where if something happens, when this lever gets pulled, when this element changes, it's going to have upstream or downstream impacts on something else, right? So if, the cost of compute for AI, for example, were to go way down, what are the ramifications? What are the next things that'll happen because of that? Or if the cost of AI computing stays the same, or let's say it goes up from where it is now, what are the things that can happen, that will happen, that won't happen? So, I think we tend to maybe pick too big of an aperture in terms of what we try and figure out, maybe too general in terms of what we try and figure out. But it's been interesting. Let me put a little bit of context around this. And our process might be slightly unusual, but I'll try and bring it back to sort of reality. For a year, probably a year or so ago, maybe even a little more than a year ago, even 2 years ago, we started getting a whole bunch of pitches from people. And so for those of you that don't know, part of doing the podcast is we only know so many people in the industry. We've been very fortunate to get to know a lot of people, but we only know so many people in the industry. And a lot of people reach out to us and they say, hey, could so-and-so come on your podcast, right? Sometimes it's represented by some agency. Sometimes it's, the person themselves or, but anyways, a lot of people reach out to us and say, hey, I think I would be interesting. I think I have something interesting to say. I think I'd be a useful guest to your audience and so forth. And so, we have to go through the process of figuring out, does that make sense or not? And what we noticed in the AI space was a lot of the people that were put forth to us, whether they reached out themselves or through somebody else, were in terms of qualifications, in terms of background, were like incredibly interesting and incredibly well accomplished. So, it wouldn't be unusual for somebody to go, yes, I'd like to propose a certain person. They spent 12 years starting the AI research lab at MIT and then had a presidential fellow opportunity at Stanford and then went off and did this. And, and you can have different opinions about, should that sort of, big academic record or something that's done, in academia or research be put on the same level as somebody who, starts a company and builds some amazing technology, whatever it is. But anyways, we were getting these backgrounds and resumes that were quite honestly sort of overwhelming. We asked ourselves a lot, like, should we have these people on the show? Because quite honestly, we very well may be asking somebody who lives at an incredibly high level of knowledge of something, kindergarten level questions. And we didn't necessarily want to waste their time. And then to a certain extent, we really weren't sure that we were qualified to even just be talking to these people, right? I mean, obviously we were curious about the things that they were interested in or that they, brought to the marketplace or that they were working on. And we were interested in their point of view, but there was a certain amount of, and I don't even want to call it sort of imposter syndrome. It was just like, it would be like having your kindergartner talk to Albert Einstein and just being like, I hope we're not wasting that person's time because the things they're doing seem to be really important. And if they're going to, spend an hour doing something, I don't waste their time. Anyway, so we went through a lot of that the first, couple of years. And to a certain extent, we still go through that sometimes when people reach out to us and say, hey, we'd like to come and talk to you about this thing. And that's bled through quite honestly in a few of the podcasts. Sometimes we cut things out, but there are many times when we have to sort of apologize to the guest for saying, hey, I know this seems like an incredibly dumb question, incredibly simplistic question. I really apologize for making you go to this low level of explanation, but would you mind doing that? And I think that to a certain extent kind of captures a little bit of what we've been going through, is that it feels like to a certain extent with AI, it's a technology or a set of technologies or a field of study that's been around for a very long time. And for a very long time, as we've talked about on some shows with folks like Sam Charrington and other people, the technology has sort of shown itself in various ways. In some cases, we don't even know that it's really doing the thing behind the scenes. It's a recommendation engine on Amazon, or it's something making a prediction about the weather, like on the weather app or something. But we don't really think about that as like, oh, that's AI. We're just sort of like, oh, that's it's been given its own name. Oh, it's a recommendation. Oh, it's a prediction. And so we're like, well, no, that's just statistics, or that's just whatever. And we don't necessarily think of it as like machine learning or artificial intelligence or something, right? There's this weird sort of hierarchy of terms. But anyways, as we've kind of dug into it, we've kind of told ourselves, okay, it's okay to do that, because quite honestly, as we've talked about, when ChatGPT kind of came along, it was kind of the moment when the mainstream was introduced to AI. And I think of it in the same context of, yes, there were lots and lots of mobile phones, and there was lots and lots of things before the iPhone, right? There was BlackBerry, and there was all sorts of devices and so forth. But the iPhone essentially unlocked the whole concept of computing in your pocket, of mobile computing, of the entire internet, and all sorts of incredibly powerful things being put into a form factor that could be brought to the individual, that they could take with them at any moment in time, right? It wasn't as clunky as like walking around with a laptop. It wasn't a desktop that needed a desk, or it was the entire thing. And to a certain extent, ChatGPT was sort of the iPhone moment for AI, in terms of most people could grasp the concept of, I'm going to interact with this thing and it's going to give me back information in a very different way than I ever had before. And that the way that information came along is quote unquote AI, right? And so we've been going through this process of trying to figure things out. And so for myself, one of the things that I try and figure out, and that I struggle with and I'm trying to get better at, is kind of the process of learning something that isn't entirely new. Because again, like I mentioned, the AI field, the domain, it's gone through lots of different iterations over the last number of decades, not like the last couple of years, but the number of decades. You can go back and look up things like AI winter and machine learning and predictive analysis, and all those sort of things kind of came before we started calling everything AI. Is to figure out, how do you start? Where do you start? Really, and where do you start is probably better than how do you start, because starting to learn is not hard. There's lots of ways to do that: blogs and videos and online courses and asking a friend and all sorts of things, webinars. But where do you start? What are the most important fundamentals to learn? What are the most elemental building blocks that if you don't understand these basic things, you're going to struggle just in the field as a whole? And then, like I mentioned to a certain extent at the top of the hour, which things are most important to you, right? And this is where it gets really interesting, because there are going to be a set of people who are going to see things like AI, and they're simply going to look at it and they're going to go, I don't care how it works. I don't really care how it works. I just want something that's going to make my life easier, make me better at work, save me time, save me money, whatever that might be. And friend of the show, Cote, who folks know, Michael Cote, over on Software Defined Talk and other places, he's done a great series of videos talking about just how do you kind of build your own personal roadmap, if you will, to using AI technologies. And he sort of talks about experimentation and using different tools and kind of trying to put yourself into different situations. So there's that, and that's going to be there's going to be a subset of people in the industry, whether they are people we think of as being tech people, or whether they're just people who have to interact with technology, in which that's going to be their world. And if it goes no farther than that, there will be lots of advancements in that space that will make their life better, right? Whether they are trying to do things with writing, or come up with ideas, or writing software, or trying to generate marketing content or visuals for whatever it might be, right? And then there's going to be people who are required or are interested in learning more about kind of the fundamentals of it, right? Like, how does this stuff work, and how does A connect to B, and could if it was a path of A, B, C, D, like could one of those be skipped, right? Like what will be the thing that will move us forward? What will be the thing that will change the economics of where we are today with that? And I think to a certain extent, Aaron and I fall into that category. Not that we didn't fall into the previous category of, kind of looking for some tools that'll help us make life easier. And so what we've been going through, what I've been going through is first and foremost figuring out, where do you start the learning process? Should you be looking at models, right? Are models kind of the fundamental building block of AI? Is that the most important thing to be looking at? Or should you be looking at like use cases and workflows and, just sort of problematic spaces in society, in your life, in the business that you work in, and sort of maybe work backwards from that, right? That might be another way of kind of working backwards to the solution from the problem. Should you start at the core technology and then start exploring, well, could it do this? Could it do that? So there's a certain amount of that I'm going through that I'm trying to figure out what's the right way to do that. The second thing is once you then figure that out is to go, okay, what are the most important things? And it's really interesting because the space is moving so fast and the level of confidence or irrational confidence from the people that are working in this space. And again, this is where you get into kind of going, how long has this person been working in this space? So you read a blog from somebody, for example, you watch a video, watch an online video or something, and you kind of go like, how long have they been working in this space? How much confidence should they have? Have they been working on this for 10 years and they've got a PhD in, whatever crazy math that's behind the scenes? Like, yeah, that person probably sort of deserves a bunch of at least respect or at least recognition that like I should give their ideas and their knowledge, certain gravitas, right? There's other people who have that exact same level of confidence that have been working on this for 6 months and have done nothing more than build an application that interacts with like the OpenAI API, right? And so the hard part is kind of figuring out, sorting through the signal from the noise of like, which one of those people should I believe in? Which one of them, and it isn't always, just sort of longevity is, right? In some cases, it's just like, that's a really smart person that this is all they've been doing for 6 months, right? So that's a weird space to be. The second space is that so much of this stuff is moving quickly that the thing that you heard about 3 months ago or 6 months ago or a week ago or whatever, you're still sometimes trying to get a sense of, kind of balance, kind of focus, So sometimes if let's say you're on a boat and the boat's rocking and you're trying to get your balance, or you go into some place and the lights are really bright or they're really dark and you're trying to get your focus of vision, there's a certain feeling of that with AI right now, where, for example, this is just something that I've kind of gone through, is when people talk about models, right, they'll talk about, the number of parameters that were used to train the model. And so we hear about models that have 7 billion parameters and 13 billion parameters and 70 billion parameters and a trillion parameters, right? And so, you start hearing about all these things and they're all based in things with really big numbers, right? So if somebody told you, hey, I have essentially a model or a database that has 7 billion parameters within it, you might go, oh, well, 7 billion seems like a pretty big number. That's a pretty big model, right? If you don't have any context to it. And then if somebody comes along and goes, oh, no, that's a cutting edge model from, 2019. Then the cutting edge now is at least, 100 billion parameters or 500 billion parameters or whatever the next sort of number is. And so you go, oh, okay, all right, I guess, we're in this sort of chase for, the bigger it is, the better it is. Or, if it's the bigger it is, does that make it faster, right? And so you start going through this thing in your mind of like, okay, what have I dealt with before in which things were consistently getting significantly bigger all the time? And you're like, okay, is this like chips where, every 12 months or every 18 months, like a CPU would come out and the speed would double, or the amount of memory it could hold would double, and you'd be like, okay, that's just a normal pattern? Or are there big breakthroughs that have happened that have moved us from 7 billion parameters to 700 billion parameters, right? So, there's certain really fundamental things that I find myself trying to wrap my head around. And again, this is, somebody who's been doing technology for a long time, but kind of going and dealing with this as very much of a newbie. So you try and figure out your starting point. you go look for your sources of learning, and there are tons and tons of sources of learning, everything from blog posts that go into lots of detail to YouTube videos to things like Stanford and MIT have AI courses that are out there on the web, and Coursera and other stuff. So there's a richness of that. We'll put some links in the show notes for folks that are looking for those things. And then the next thing that I find is at some point, you go through that thing and you kind of put yourself back into when you were a student of some sort, whether you were in high school or university or some other way that you learned. And you start having to think about, okay, whenever things are new, you're going to be presented with a tremendous amount of information, and you're going to go through it in the best way that you can, whether you are reading papers or you are doing stuff online and sort of testing yourself out, trying to build something, whatever it might be. And for a while, you're kind of in the process of consuming information, trying to apply the information, but you're not always kind of trying to put it in context. Like, is this important? Is this, what does this relate to? Is this a centralized thing? Is this sort of an adjacent thing to the centralized thing? And so, the other thing next thing I'm trying to figure out is, at what point do I sort of stop and step back and look at things and go, okay, I understand that it's a fundamental building block, or it's a sort of adjacent building block, or it's, it's in the news or whatever, but what does it mean? What does it matter? Like, we learn these things, but what does it matter? Like, what does it matter that something is bigger or faster or, gives you 7 different options? Like, what does that matter? What does that relate back to in a business context? What does it relate back to in terms of the broader technology kind of landscape and so forth? And so that to me feels like the second thing that I'm constantly going through, which is, first was what to go kind of dig into. Second is when to step back and try and put some context around it, so that if I'm digging into something, maybe I don't dig as deep, because I go, okay, that, what, now that I really think about that and I really understand it now, it doesn't matter that much. This other thing matters twice as much. So spend more time digging into that. So I'm trying to find kind of the right cadence of when to step back at those things. And then the third thing is, in my case, in Aaron's case to a certain extent, and for some of you, this may or may not matter, but oftentimes one of the things that I have to do, whether it's my day job or on this podcast or whatever, is be able to explain it. And I say that, and it's probably something that is probably a valuable skill for a lot of people, is that if you are working on something, and it really doesn't matter if it's technology or if you're an accountant or you're a carpenter or you're whatever, at some point you're going to have to interact with other people. And there are plenty of people who are really smart about certain things or really skilled in certain things, but they struggle to a point. They could be excellent up to a point, but they maybe struggle to advance their career or advance their capabilities or grow their business or whatever, because they don't develop the skill set to be able to explain things. And I explain it in, that old kind of cliche of, explain it to me like I'm a 6-year-old, make it simple for me. I don't need all the details, but please kind of get the main point across. Or also explain it to, somebody who is going to be your peer and needs the details, but, is in a learning curve sense behind you, and you're trying to help them accelerate and so forth. So, I find myself oftentimes, once I've figured out something, once I sort of stop and look at it in context, is I sort of force myself to go, okay, can I explain this? And just explaining it, writing it out. Oftentimes you find yourself realizing, I don't know this as well as I thought I did, right? I can explain the first couple things, but I can't get to the conclusion. I can't get to the why it's important. I can get to the what it is, but maybe not the why it's important. Or I seem to be able to explain it to a technologist, but I can't put the numbers next to it to explain it to somebody on the business side of the world. And so, that's an element of trying to, kind of learn this that I'm going through as well. And I'm sure some of you, have to kind of go through that as well. And then the last thing that I find is, and I mentioned this a little bit at the beginning, is at some point you're going to realize, I got questions. I'm lost. I don't know if what I'm looking at makes sense. I don't know if what I'm reading is important, all those types of things. And you kind of have to ask yourself, you have to go ask people questions. And again, this goes back to figuring out, who do you ask questions of? Who intimidates you? Who do you feel like you're not wasting their time? And I'll give you an example of kind of something that sat with me for a long time, and I've kind of had to deal with it. I've had to figure out how to deal with it over my career. So many years ago, I worked at a company. I worked in sort of kind of their research group, if you will. And I was a product manager, so I was trying to put together. I was kind of trying to find the intersection between the interest, kind of the interest in the technology, the applicability of new technology, but also trying to relate it in a business context, right? So that Venn diagram, if you will. And one of the things that we were fortunate to have was to have some really, really smart engineers that we got to work with, sort of distinguished engineer level engineers. And I went up to one of them, and this guy was patently brilliant. Had dozens and dozens of patents in a bunch of different domains. So just, kind of one of those, like the smartest guy in the world that in real life. And I went up to him and asked him a question. I said, "Hey, Billy, I've been thinking about this thing." And in my mind, I had been thinking about it for like a week. I'd been trying to come up with all the different angles to it. I've been trying to figure out, I can't even remember what exactly it was. Was it important? Will this work? All, kind of those types of things. But literally felt like I'd been thinking about it for a week and kind of racking my brain and was like, okay, I'm at the end of my wits. I'm going to go ask this really smart guy. Hopefully he can give me a way of thinking about it. And I asked him the question, and I said, blah, 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 whatever, here it is, the question. And he looked at me and he paused for a long time. I mean, probably a good 10 seconds, to the point where I was like, did I mumble? Do we not speak the same language? Kind of that level of awkwardness. I mean, it was a long pause, 10, 15 seconds. And then he kind of took a deep breath and he said, boy, I've never even thought to think about it like that. And the implication that he basically made was that that's such a simplistic way of looking at this really hard problem, or whatever it was, that somebody who's really smart had never conceived the idea of, like, I should think about that, whether it was like a minute detail or whatever it was. And I think there's a lot of times when we work on stuff, we think we're working on something diligently, we're putting our best foot forward, and we realize, like, we're up against it. We can't go any further with the knowledge that we have, or the ability to sort of learn the way that we're learning. Not that we can't push through, but we need some sort of help. And there can be a level of intimidation to go ask the person that is smarter on this stuff, is way more qualified on this stuff. And I think the advice I would give is just, you just have to sort of live with the idea of, like, there will always be times when you just don't know, and there will be a thing that you think is a dumb question or a great question, and you just have to ask and live with whatever the feedback is. And hopefully the people that you're working with are reasonable and don't make you feel like an idiot. I know plenty of situations in which they will make you feel like an idiot, and that's it's kind of part of the technical hierarchy. It's not great, but it happens. But you have to be willing to go, hey, if I really am interested in learning this stuff, like, I have to ask the questions, and I have to find people that, A, I'm not necessarily afraid to ask the questions of, but B, have knowledge, like, know the answers to the questions. So I think it's worth taking that chance, reaching out to some people and just being like, look, maybe we don't know each other, maybe we do know each other really well, but I have a question, can you help me with it? So anyways, I think as I've been thinking about this process, and again, I didn't necessarily get into like lots of AI stuff, but I'm sort of thinking through the process of, like, what happens when you go and learn something that feels very new and different and uncomfortable and so forth. I think the areas I've been focusing on are what are the most important areas to focus on, and hopefully those are going to be the most relevant to the area that you work in. The second area is, how do you determine legitimacy, especially when there is so much happening, so many announcements, so many blogs, people are putting stuff out there and all that kind of stuff. How do you then force yourself to figure out if you know it well enough? Can you explain it to people? Can you put it in context? Can you step back and realize, like, okay, should I keep learning in this space or should I move forward? And then finally, going back to sort of the title of this, the sort of fear and excitement, is to be okay with asking questions when there's probably going to be a level of uncomfortableness. So anyways, that's kind of the process that I know both Aaron and I have been going through. We're fortunate enough to kind of have each other to sort of go, hey, I have a question. It might be a dumb question, it might be a hard question. And there's times when one of us knows the answer and one of us doesn't know the answer, and we'll go off and kind of figure it out. But But yeah, I encourage anybody who's trying to figure out this new space. And again, I put this in the context of AI. Maybe you're just trying to learn something different than what you did before. Maybe you were in, security before, and you're getting into, writing software or something, and you feel uncomfortable. But that's kind of the process that we've been going through. And it is something that, literally on a daily basis, you go from, I am really excited about this, to what in the world am I doing? I don't understand it. Like, there's that sort of fear and loathing kind of thing. And then excitement will come back maybe an hour later or something, or a day later. So, it's something you have to kind of press through. It's something you have to be a little bit determined to figure out, and just realize that there's gonna be plenty of days when you're just frustrated because these things don't make sense. And, you're kind of questioning some of the fundamental stuff that you went into. So anyways, with that, I will wrap it up. Hope you all are doing well. Hopefully you're enjoying the weather. Hopefully you are getting a chance to get outside. I apologize for the show being late. Yesterday I was outside quite a bit, and if you were watching me on video, if I had done this on video, my eyes would have been basically swollen shut from all the pollen that's out there. So I think we're right at the end of the pollen for North Carolina. Unfortunately, it has lasted longer than it usually does, and I think I read somewhere it is twice the levels that it normally is. So we're going through some stuff, but hopefully we are toward the end of it and getting through it. Anyways, with that, thank you all for listening. Thanks for telling a friend about the show. Thanks for helping us grow the show. Thanks for a lot of the folks who have been sending us some really interesting feedback about some of the recent shows. We appreciate them as DMs or emails, show@thecloudcast.net. You can find all of our social media stuff in the bottom of the show notes that are published each week. So with that, I'll wrap it up. I'll talk to you next week.